All right, for this week, we're going to start with the question, who am I, or who are you? And in a lot of ways, when we want to get to know ourselves, this seems like the fundamental question that we would always want to ask ourselves. And we oftentimes think that, oh, if I could just answer this question of who am I, somehow or another I will know myself. But there's a bit of a problem with that. Consider the common ways that we know ourselves, typically with our names. So I'm Eric Oliver, or John Eric Oliver more formally. But those don't really say very much about me. I mean, there are tons and tons of Johns, tons and tons of Erics. There's even another famous John Oliver. All our names are really supposed to do is just mark us from the herd. I mean, my name could be XJ5279, and that would be just as effective. But of course, that's not how names work. Names have power. If my name were Schleprock or Hitler or Pepsi, those have specific connotations with us. I once had a student a few years ago whose given name was Mr. Cutie Patootie. And I was like going down the roll and he was like, Mr. Cutie Patootie, and he raised his hand, he was like, Jason. And I was like, gotcha, say no more. And you know, the same thing goes with really all of our identities as well. We think that we have all of these identities that somehow or another define us. So here I am, I'm a white guy, I'm a guy, I'm a middle-aged professor, sometimes I'm a clumsy dancer. But those don't really define me at my core. They don't define me as an energy system. They don't necessarily even define me largely as an animal. All of those identities really vary by context and place. So sometimes my racial identity is really salient, sometimes it's not. Sometimes my gender is really salient, sometimes it's not. You can go down the list. So if we really want to know why we are who we are, if we really want to get to this issue of what our words and languages tell us about ourselves, we need to go something a little bit that's behind this whole question of what is making us a who. We need to get to language. For language is what really structures who we are. Animals that are on the wild don't think about who they are. Koalas don't give themselves names. Zebras don't think of themselves as striped. Lions don't feel bad about killing antelopes. It's only humans who do those things. It's only humans who give themselves names, identities, or even make moral judgments on their actions. And if we want to understand what's going on with all of that, we need to get to the heart of what's happening with this and what really makes us distinct to this layer of the self. And this is the linguistic self, and this is language. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. And I want to start with a seemingly strange question, which was, what was the first domesticated species, if you had to guess? Any ideas?
Silkworms.
Silkworms? No, later on. Not a bad guess. Cats? No, not cats. Earlier than cats.
The horse.
No, way earlier than the horse. Nope, not a bird. Dogs. Yeah, I mean, it seems like dogs. I mean, dogs of all the species that you named, silkworms, horses, cats, dogs go back about 35,000 years in human history. And how do we know this? Well, a few years ago in Siberia, some researchers found a dog skeleton. And how did they know it was a dog skeleton? Well, you look at the skull, and you see that, dogs look very different from wolves. They tend to be a little shorter in snouts, they're a little cuter, they're less kind of robust than a wolf. But then this begs the question of what is it about domestication that created the dog to look the way it was? I mean, after all, if you think that the reason why our ancestors first domesticated wolves was probably as hunters and protectors. And so if that's what you want a wolf to do, wouldn't you want to get a wolf that's sort of larger and more robust and more fierce? Why do you get an animal in its domestication that's kind of smaller and more gentle? And the answer to this question came from some remarkable experiments by this guy. His name was Dmitry Belyaev. He was a Soviet geneticist, and he started doing work with Russian silver foxes. Now, the Soviet Union had a big trade in animal furs at this time. They had these big fox factories, And so Belyaev starts working at one of these, and he wants to answer a simple question. He decides to do an experiment, which is, how long would it take him to domesticate one of these silver foxes? So he took basically the tamest of each of the silver foxes with generations, put them together and bred them, and did this over subsequent generations. And within 10 generations, he basically had a domesticated silver fox. How did he know it was domesticated? Well, it did a number of things. Suddenly, it would come up to him and it would lick his hand. It began to bark like a little dog would. It's behaviorally speaking, it was interactive with him. It would respond to his communications. But more interestingly, the silver foxes also had some physical changes to them too. Their ears got floppy. Their coats got molted. Their tails got curved. They became more gracile, i.e. sort of smaller in build. They became more neotenous. They became more like kind of cute in their faces. And all of these traits together are what we now call domestication syndrome. And when you domesticate an animal, basically, you go from being something that's formidable and kind of fierce into generally something that's cuter, smaller in stature, kind of dumber. Actually, domesticated creatures aren't as sharp as wild creatures. This, however, once we know this, causes us to re-examine the first question. Because if you go back and you say, okay, what was really the first domesticated species? It wasn't a dog, it was that. And this makes sense. After all, if we were the ones domesticating dogs, then it makes sense that we were the first domesticated species. And if you look at the human fossil record, it looks like we have all the hallmarks of domestication. So for example, take what might have been an early Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago. Probably resembles something like this. A very, very formidable creature, your early human ancestor. Tough, kind of wiry, built like stocky like a wrestler, heavy brow, fierce creature. I mean, think about where it was surviving. It was surviving in the savannas of Africa, where mega predators were all around it. Knew a lot about its habitat. This was a very sharp creature. Very, very attuned to its natural environment. Then you go sort of move forward, and you have someone like, say, 100,000 years ago, all of our ancestors were still in Africa, and they probably resembled this guy. Still pretty formidable, pretty badass, but a little cuter. Kind of resembles, okay, maybe a little bit more relatable. Then you move forward, and I'm going to look at here at San people here in Africa. This is probably the oldest human kind of genetic lineage. And if you notice them compared to the other pictures, they're far more gracile. They're far cuter. They look far, far more domesticated. And so this raises the interesting question, who or what domesticated us? Any ideas? Yeah.
We did it to ourselves.
We did it to ourselves, yeah. It was probably not aliens. Okay, we can scratch aliens off the list. Maybe. Okay, living together, we're getting warm.
Like agriculture?
Okay, this all happened way before agriculture. Agriculture is a very recent innovation. It's only like 10,000 years old. What do you need to have culture, society, civilization living together?
Language.
Yes. I think if you think about the one thing that really changed during this period of time, it was language. Language domesticated us. Language fundamentally changed the nature of our species. And just think about this for a little bit. Think about this guy. Imagine cooperating with this guy. Really, really hard to do. If you want to have language, if you want to speak to someone, you have to sort of say, okay, listen, we're going to have this word, and we're going to call this word fire. And we have to agree that everyone's going to agree that this word is fire. And then this guy comes along and he has undoubtedly his own annoying word for fire that he's insisting on. You can't have that. You need some level of docility in order to share language. And it was the docile creatures, it was the docile humans who could begin coming up with words and sharing meaning and words with each other. And it was really this that catapulted our species above and beyond all the other ones. It was language that really differentiates us as humans from any other species on the planet. And it was language that domesticated us. Now this may raise a few eyebrows because you might be thinking, oh, what do you mean that we're the only creature with language? You know, what about those whale sounds? What about the dog, my dog I can communicate with? It's very easy for us to think that dogs communicate. I don't know if you ever heard of that show Lassie. It was a TV show in the 50s where Lassie would kind of come up and start like barking and people would interpret it. There isn't a tendency for us to believe that all animals speak and have language in the way that we do. And animals basically don't. There's a lot of really important differentiations between how animals communicate with one another and how we do. And we can kind of go down this various list. Like we humans, when we speak, we can make abstractions. I can say the word fire and you can know what I mean even though there's no fire present. Moreover, I can say the word fire and it can have different meanings depending on our context. So, you know, I could say fire is a thing that burns. I could say fire as in getting fired up. I could say fire as in you're fired. Fire as in firing out of a cannon. And so all of these are going to be depends on the other words that I'm saying at the time. Language is temporal. Whenever animals are communicating, they're only communicating in the particular moment with each other. They can't like meow or bark about something that happened last week. That's not how they work. We can, when we invoke language, we move ourselves differentially in time. We invent language. We can generate and create new ways of communicating with each other. We also have syntax and grammar. We can structure and order our grammar according to certain kinds of rules. And we can go down this list and you could basically say animals don't have any of these types of characteristics. When animals are communicating, it's a lot like social media, and particularly like Twitter or what's called now X. It's just kind of one-way signals meant to go out and disrupt something in the environment. When, you know, a chimpanzee is out there shaking bushes or beating its chest or flinging its poo, it's not trying to build shared meaning or understanding. It's just trying to change something in its environment. And so when animals are out there and you hear bird calls, it's like Twitter. They're just like, you know, one message and another message and another message and another message. There's no dialogue. There's no real effort to build a shared understanding that's then mutually binding in any kind of way. This is what language does. And this takes us to what I think is the third big layer of the self. If we want to understand ourselves, we need to understand the type of self processes that are created and generated by language. And I call this the linguistic self. Whereas, you know, our cellular self is there trying to resist entropy and keep itself going and keep the flame of life alive. And the animal self is out there thinking and feeling in order to sort of basically make maps of the world and make predictions so this multicellular organism can keep resisting entropy and surviving. The linguistic self is out there labeling and judging the world, making rules, structuring an order to ourselves and our environments based on our culture and based on our shared technologies. It's a synthetic layer of self. It's a layer of self now that we are creating. And as we'll see, this has empowered us in all kinds of enormous ways, and it's also come at a great cost. And so what I want to talk about today is language and self-processes. Basically how language structures us and how it structures our self-processes. And I want to talk about four kind of key aspects of them. How language shapes our self-understanding, how language shapes our thinking, how language creates moral communities and laws, and how language affects our deepest kind of self-processes, in particular how it begins to shape our animal selves. And so let's go through this. And I want to start with the first one. And I want to start with a simple question here. What's the difference between myself and myself? This is oftentimes a question that comes up in this class. Myself, the two words, myself, these have been the subject of this course up to this point. The self being all of those processes within us that are basically resisting entropy and negotiating with reality and keeping the life force going. And they can have taken various incarnations in our cellular self, our structure, our animal cells, our DNA, everything about this. Myself is a reflexive pronoun. It is something that I am using when I'm referring to myself as an object of inquiry, that's somehow or another specific to me as an individual. Myself, the second version, is not possible without language. And I think the first person to really elucidate this was William James. He was an American psychologist and philosopher in the latter part of the 19th century. He basically was one of the founders of psychology, and he came up with, I think, a really, really important point for us, and it's the difference between I and me. Most animals have a feeling of I. They do have a feeling of self, but it's very much encapsulated within this moment, and it's always from this first person perspective. So when animals go and do things, it's I. They don't really have a means of self-reflection. They can't stop and ponder on themselves. And they can't do that because they don't have a mechanism to do this. Think about this. Like, how can you think about yourself without words and concepts? Maybe you can sense your body, and maybe you can manipulate your body a little bit, and maybe there's a little bit of self-reflection that's there. But this self-reflection is headless. You can't really see your face. It only takes you so far. You can only kind of see kind of what's from the neck down. And that's a pretty limited self-understanding. Language then, when we have terms like names, identities, social structures, we have ways of identifying ourselves and beginning to then reflect on ourselves as an object of inquiry. So this is really, really important to think about. Most animals really can't do this. Language generates a feeling of me. And I mean, think about this. When babies are born, it's just all one big feeling of I. You know, for its first 18 months, a baby doesn't really differentiate itself from its environment. It's, you know, even when human babies are born, up until the first 8 weeks, they can't really even see all that well. They can't even make out their own parents' faces. Babies are just this blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James describes it. They're just out there groping about, and it's all one big sense of I. As babies begin to develop, around 18 months of age, they begin to develop a self-concept. They begin to understand themselves as, you know, as a person. And what's happening at 18 months of age? They begin to acquire language. The same time that they're learning to speak, they're learning to see themselves. Like our child would be like me. Her name was Esme, and she was like, Edme. Like that was some of her first words that she would say. She's beginning to recognize herself. But do you need language to actually have a self-concept? Yeah, we're seeing this coincidence between language development and this creation of the self-concept, but are the two fundamentally dependent on each other? And the person to try to answer this question in the 1960s was a psychologist by the name of Gordon Gallup. And Gallup had an interesting idea. He was like, what if we try to see if animals have self-concepts by giving them and seeing how they respond to themselves in a mirror? And so, like with a lot of animals in the wild, if you put a mirror up in front of them, they usually won't recognize it at first. And sometimes they even think it's a competitor, and they'll try to attack it. Or some animals just sort of stare at it. And the question is when animals are looking in a mirror, as when a child is looking in a mirror, does it see its own reflection? Does it recognize itself as a me that's there? And so what Gallup basically did is he would sedate the animals or surreptitiously distract the child and then put a little mark on their face. And then reintroduce them to a mirror and see if they responded to the mark on their face. And if they responded to the mark on their face, it might indicate some notion of self-concept. And so there are certain kinds of animals that seem to be able to do this. There are certain kinds of birds. Chimpanzees seem to be able to pass the mirror test. Dolphins seem to be able to do this, maybe even some elephants. With children, this also usually happens around 18 months of age. Prior to 18 months of age, when children are in the mirror, they don't seem to be able to pass the mirror test. This varies a little bit by culture. In some cultures it's a little longer, but it's usually around 18 months to 36 months of age where children seem to be able to indicate this. Now, the question that we have though, is this really self-awareness? Or is this something else? I mean, one of the problems with putting someone in front of a mirror is that a mirror is a human technology. Like language, it's something that we have constructed. Mirrors don't really exist in the wild. I know you could say, oh, I know there are ponds and reflections where you see yourself. It's not really like a mirror. This doesn't have the sharp refraction that a mirror offers. One thing we might wonder about is a mirror really reflecting true self-awareness? And there's a big, big debate about this. And another person to kind of think about this was an anthropologist by the name of Edmund Carpenter. And around the same time that Gordon Gallup was conducting these mirror experiments, Edmund Carpenter was very curious about how humans who had not been exposed to technologies like mirrors and photographs would respond to these things. Would they recognize themselves? Would they have the same kind of self-concept? So he went to the Biami people in Papua New Guinea who were in a very, very remote area. These were people who lived in a pre-literate society, had no exposure to photographs or mirrors, and he basically gave them and showed them their reflections in a mirror. And he showed them pictures of themselves with Polaroids. And the Biami, when they first saw this, they were horrified. They were just scared. They had never encountered this. And what Carpenter suggested was because their self-concept, it's not that they didn't have a self-concept, but somehow or another their self-concept was no longer within their control. It was like when you hear the sound of your own voice in a recording. It was like you, but it's not you. It seems alien to them. And they were just simply not accustomed to this. And so, they were just scared to death of it. But the other interesting thing here, that after a while, Biami quickly acclimated to seeing their own images. And soon they began to groom themselves and posture themselves. And then, when we think about it, Carpenter was remarkably insensitive. I mean, here is this very pristine culture, and he's coming in and he's fundamentally altering this culture here by introducing this new technology. But what it also shows is that the way we generate a self-concept is fundamentally dependent upon our technologies. As our technologies develop, as our technologies grow, our self-concepts shift in relationship to them. Language is a technology, and then all of the things that language allows for are further technologies, and all of these things shape us. I mean, have any of you ever looked into a true mirror? You guys know what a true mirror is? A true mirror is a reflection. You know how when you look in a mirror, everything gets reversed? A true mirror takes your reflection and unreverses it. And if you look in it, you actually see how people actually see you. And you can see these are people who are seeing themselves in a true mirror, and it's a really novel, powerful experience. Or you see yourself in a totally different light. And this is what our technologies do. They reflect ourselves back to us, and they refract back to us new ways of self-conceptualization. And so language changed the way we began to comprehend ourselves. So, I don't say to you, you take a class with I, or you like I say you take a class with me, or you like me. And that within that me then becomes a lot. It becomes certain kinds of responsibilities, becomes certain kinds of values. Language begins to pack a lot into it, and that, of course, packs into our own self-conception. And then this takes me to the second point when I want to talk about here, which is how language shapes our thinking. If we think about how the animal self is out there, the animal self is collecting lots of information through its sense organs. It's building this information together in terms of perception. It's organizing this perception in terms of some base level concepts. But all of these are present and immediate. With language, that takes us up to a new order. And I want to try to demonstrate this with a simple exercise. And once you're able then to locate your concentration on your breath, keep meditating until a thought comes into your mind. And when a thought comes into your mind, just open your eyes and stop meditating. So what is behind that? Or let me ask you guys a question. When you were having this thought in your head, how is your thought structured? How would you describe that thought? Yeah.
Linguistically, there are words.
Yeah, inevitably when we start thinking, when you're doing your meditation, and this is one of the reasons why I'm encouraging you to do meditation. It's a great way of exploring how your own mind works. And think about it. What normally distracts us when we're meditating is this discourse. It's these, and this discourse is usually words. Maybe it's sometimes imagery, but more often than not, it's really words. Language changes and structures and orders the way our brains accumulate, put together, and organize information. And when we're not doing something, so for example, this is my dog Aesop. When Aesop is out in the park, what he is sensing and the way he's responding to it, he's picking up pieces of information. You know, he's maybe registering grass, trees, squirrels, definitely squirrels. But he's all doing that, and it's all bound in the moment. And he's processing this information by how it makes him feel. It's all very immediate. How we think about, the world, if we were like Aesop and we just started meditating, we would just probably just be sitting there, just whatever is in the moment at hand. Instead, we start ruminating. We start generating ideas. We start having thoughts about things that are not immediately present, intrude into our consciousness. This is what language does. Language begins to structure and order how we go about understanding the world. And what it does in this way is language gets us to start thinking in categories. When we acquire language, we begin to acquire concepts. And what concepts basically are ideas about things and processes in the world. So I get a notion of, I learned what the word for tree is. And suddenly that structures and orders my thinking. I always think when certain trees have certain characteristics to them. They have leaves, they have branches, they have a trunk. And then I begin to think about things in terms of an idealized tree. And I begin to judge things by virtue of idealized trees. And I think about, like, children when they're learning, they think about, books and dogs, and they learn the terms for these things. And not only do they learn the terms for these things, but they learn about expectations about how these things are going to be. A dog is not going to tell you a story. A book is not going to pee on the rug. When we are acquiring language, we are not only acquiring, ways of mapping the world or making predictions about the world, we are acquiring labels for those maps. And we're assigning probabilities to our predictions. So this is a really important idea to think about. Language is totally structuring the ways our minds map reality by putting these labels on them. It's also giving us a new frame of reference for the predictions that we so desperately want to make about this reality that we're mapping. That allows us to make strong and careful and oftentimes very productive assumptions about this. Language then also shapes our consciousness. If you think about what happens when you are thinking to yourself, when you have basically a voice in your head or you're processing language, you are both creating the voice and you're hearing it at the same time. And the psychologist Julian Jaynes calls it the bicameral mind. Even as I'm speaking to you now, there's a part of my brain that's listening to what I'm saying, and I can get there, and have you ever do this where it gets kind of strange, where you can start hearing yourself talk and then you feel dissociated from the part of yourself that's actually talking? And I'm actually experiencing this right now, and it's a little weird, so I'm gonna stop doing it. Okay. Julian Jaynes says we do that all the time. Most of the time it's kind of subtle, but sometimes when we are processing language, there's also a part of our mind that's hearing it. And this is the nature of consciousness, and it goes back to sort of different brain regions that are involved in this. In the left hemisphere of your brain, there are two important areas that process language for you. One of which is known as Broca's area, and this is where speaking words originate. If you have aphasia to this area of your brain, your ability to speak is going to be greatly, greatly impaired. And then there's Wernicke's area, and this area is about understanding and comprehending language. So when we're speaking or when we're hearing language, both of these parts of the brains are lighting up. You see a lot of activity in networks connected to these parts of the brain. But there's also activity in the right hemisphere that's happening as well. And Jaynes suggests that this is the hallucinatory self. This is the part that's oftentimes generating the thoughts that are then crossing back over here and being translated into words, being translated into concepts, and then being understood and heard by a different part of the brain. And Jaynes has this interesting hypothesis. He basically says, if you go back and look at pre-literate societies, and if you look in particular, like for example, in Europe or the Levant, in pre-literate times, people didn't understand that the voice in their head was their own thoughts. They basically thought it was the gods talking to them. And so if you look, for example, at the earliest chapters of the Hebrew Bible, if you look at the Iliad, if you look at these early pieces of literature that we don't have people who are cognizant of their own psychology. We don't have people who are aware that they, in fact, are the authors for a lot of thoughts in their heads. They're making attributions to the gods all the time. Gods are coming to them, giving them commandments, telling them what to do, motivating their actions. They're hearing these words. And this takes us then to the next and then kind of important part of how language structures us. Language allows us to have rules.